Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Email Management with SharePoint and Teams. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. We'll also make a recording of this webcast available to you within a couple of days. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, David Lavender, Harmony Chief Product Officer. David has served as an executive in enterprise software, mobile, security, and networking companies. David is an international scholar for the Society for the History of Technology, a founding member of the Humanizing the Digital Workplace Consortium, and a longtime contributor to CMS Wire. Before we start, we'd like to ask you a question. How do you currently store emails to and from clients and customers? In SharePoint, Exchange, different off-the-shelf email management solution, custom solution, or we're looking for a new solution? Okay, let's see the results. David.
Thanks, Maya. Good day to everybody, and welcome to those who are dialing in from their workplace and those who are dialing in from home. You know, in these days of remote working, it is even more important than ever to organize information correctly so we can work efficiently and effectively and things don't go missing, especially after everybody returns to the workplace and the context of the current work scenario is changed. So we all know that a lot of work is being done in Teams and Slack, and people are talking about using different types of communications tools, but I'm fairly certain that more than a few of us are still using email to communicate internally, but especially with outside parties like customers, suppliers, and partners. So it's super important to organize emails so that we can find them later, and that's what we're going to talk about in today's webinar. But before we get started and diving right in how to do that, let's look at the poll results. So we see that we've got about half the people say that they are saving emails in Exchange in the native place, about a quarter in SharePoint, and the rest divided up among the different solutions. So I think that's a good starting point. I think it shows that there's still an awful lot of emails that are being stored in Exchange. We'll look at if that's a good strategy or perhaps there are some alternative strategies. Same goes for the other options and solutions. So let's dive right in. So I think one of the first questions we need to ask when we talk about email is certainly something that we all use on a daily basis, and we use an awful lot of it, is what information do we really need to save? So a couple of years ago, we did there was a study by an organization called RimTech that looked at the role of email in records information compliance, and surveying a large number of organizations, they found that the email that really needs to be saved for compliance or for ongoing business needs later on, about 80% of that is emails. So, you know, we talk about records, we often think of documents. So things like contracts and agreements, work orders, invoices, and things of that nature. But a lot of that stuff actually gets sent through email. So a lot of that stuff is either sent as attachments or is embedded directly in the email message. And they found that about 80% of records or things that need to be preserved are email, and only about 15% are documents, and the rest of it are a collection of other types of what they called workflow type information. Now, if you look at just a kind of a average size company of 1,000 users with 100 emails a day, which is quite conservative, and you know, even if you look at only 5% of them. So one of the things that they found was that of all the emails that people collect, only about 5% of the overall emails are the ones that need to be saved as business records. So you're probably aware of this. You have lots of emails that come in every day, things like you know, just request for you know, somebody can't find something in the office, they'll send out an email. Somebody says, hey, did you follow up with something? Task type emails. So the vast majority of emails are not things that need to be retained. We'll look at this a little bit more in detail. But even if we look at the 5% number that that RimTech came up with, we're looking at over 1 million records a year, and that's things that need to be retained for business purposes. That's an awful lot of information. So just putting that stuff in a leaving it in an inbox, and everyone has it in their individual inbox, and then looking for it later on seems to be a very difficult way to be able to manage and find information later on. So what are those 5% emails that you need to keep? The business, we call it important business emails. So a lot of it is client correspondence. You know, people send in requests, or customers will ask for advice. If it's a professional services company, a lot of times there's requests for advice. A lot of times it's knowledge sharing. People who happen to know more, that they send out emails with information about previous customers or deals that they've been working on in the past that shed a lot of light on ongoing business. There's needs also to maintain a paper trail. So a lot of times in businesses, we were working with an organization a number of years ago where there was a contractor, and some of the customers at the end were dissatisfied with the product that the contractor had developed, and there was an argument about what the changes that the customer had asked for or not. It was extremely important to be able to find the emails with the customer change request so that there was an accurate record of what was done at the end of the day, and who was really to blame for the lack of customer satisfaction. So that's really important. A lot of proposals, building back and forth, working on different proposals with companies as you build up a statement of work or a proof of concept or any sort of type of rollout of a product or service. And then there's needs also related with things that either industry regulations or corporate record mandates. Certainly in industries like finance, insurance, places like that, or medical even today, certainly there's a lot of interest in medical records. These are types of things that need to be maintained. A lot of reason, because it's not only a matter of a lot of information hard to find, but you also have things like employee turnover, where people leave and then things get left in their inbox. It becomes difficult to find. You have geographically dispersed teams. You have people with expertise in the company. There's a lot of needs to be able to maintain the emails in such a way that they can be found. Later on. So we looked at the needs of the emails. What are the typical kind of emails that that fit in those categories, to be able to identify as we say here, only about 5% of emails are those that need to be maintained. So what are those? How do you identify those 5%? So to paraphrase George Orwell, all emails are equal, but some emails are more equal than others. It's true. So things like contract proposals, very often, and I'm sure you all have experienced this, you'll get an email that'll say something like, attached, please find my contract proposal. These are my terms. And if you agree to this, then reply with such and sign it. So the email itself not only provides the context for the document attachment, but it also contains details that are related to the business relationship, which also are form records. As I mentioned before, client correspondence, very popular in professional services. So in people providing information about advice about tax, companies providing health information, financial information. Often a client or a customer will email a question. The response comes back. The response and the question become a record, a document of record. Later on, if there's a disagreement, there's a misunderstanding, if there's need to prove what was written, those emails need to be maintained and found later on. And of course, you have things in different industries like state and local government, you've got deeds, you've got requests for repairs and so on, maintenance schedules, and a wide variety of industries like construction and utilities and oil and gas, energy, engineering plans, maintenance schedules, lots of those types of documents that need to be maintained for very long periods of time, and not only maintained, but also be found. So there's a kind of two different types of documents. There are those that need to just be maintained for regulatory purposes, things that in case the auditors come around, you need to be able to have them, and then someone will roll out a e-discovery tool to be able to find them. That's not the kind of things we're talking about here. What we're talking about here are the business emails that are actually needed to drive the business forward. Things that you need to be able to find later on as a normal course of business activity. So what are the 4 top email management challenges? There's really 4 things that make it extremely difficult to get a grip. Again, the goal of email management is to be able to find things later on for business. So in order to be able to find things, you have to take a number of steps in order to organize it. Think like you go to the library, if all the books were just arranged on the randomly on the shelves, it would be extremely difficult to find them. But there is a strategy by which books are organized in an orderly fashion, whether it's the Dewey Decimal System or some other matter of organizing the information. That's what you need to do with email. And of course, like a library, have it in a centrally located location so that it's accessible to everyone. So let's look at those 4 challenges. The first one is inconsistent email capture and classification. So you can't find what you haven't captured. If an employee who's received an important email about a proposal and they've given a response to the customer, and then that employee puts the email in their inbox and subsequently leaves the company, it is very difficult, if not impossible, ever to find a record of that conversation. So capturing the things that you need to capture in a centralized location, the penalties here could be enormous for business operations loss by not being able to capture things. 2 is inconsistent retention schedule. So oftentimes, not everything needs to be kept forever. Even things that are important for business after a period of time become no longer interesting. So if you have a contract with a company and the contract has been completed after a number of years, even that document is probably doesn't need to be left around. Any extra document that does not need to be found later on just adds to the clutter, and that clutter makes it harder to find the things you actually do need to find. So, we see things like over retention, sometimes keeping things longer, capturing more things than you need, or keeping them longer than you need to have them. Another thing about keeping things longer than you need them also increases the risk for security breaches. So if you have information that you don't need to maintain, and that information is kept and somebody manages to hack into your system, or a disgruntled employee releases that information, that's a risk that should not be taken on by the company. Challenge number 3 is non-standard and ineffective search. So if information is not organized accurately or efficiently and according to a accepted standard or method of operation, it will be very difficult to find that information later on. Doing just a word search is very difficult because people call things different things. Trying to guess what somebody called something and then look for it is not a very efficient way to look. And the last challenge is the lack of end-to-end governance. The idea is that you can put things in place, you can put procedures in place, you can make very complex documents. We always say that the most difficult thing to change is people's behavior. You can deploy the most sophisticated technology, but if you can't actually get people to do what it is that you're asking them to do, your results will not meet expectations. So the idea of making things simple enough for people so that they can do what's necessary to be able to fulfill the business requirements is all part of the governance, and being able to follow up and making sure that those things are done. Because asking people to do complex things, even if you say you're going to do training or you're going to force them to do it, you'll find always that people are able to find ways to circumvent your requests. So what is the key to successful email management? There's really two pieces that need to be done initially in order to be able to fulfill the requirements, which is to be able to find information effectively and timely when you need it for the business purposes. So the first two things you need to do is you need to be able to capture and classify. So if you first of all, capture information means take it out of people's individual inboxes, put it in a centralized location where it can be found, accessed, used by the people who need to use it in a secure and scalable fashion. That's the first part. And the second part is even just putting that stuff in a container where it can be found, where it is accessible in theory to other people, but if it's not classified, what you end up is, we often call this a document or an email graveyard, because it's there technically, but there's no way to find it. There's no way to actually make use of those documents or emails. So again, the key to being able to pull this off is not to look at ways that require change in people's behavior, because that's a surefire way for failure. No matter how people say this thing is intuitive, it's easy to use, people don't like new things, and people will always try to revert to what they know. The good thing is that people know email, people are comfortable with email. So if we're trying to manage email, there certainly has to be ways to be able to work within the framework of Outlook and Exchange to be able to get people to do what we're asking of them. So there's really two principles that are needed to fulfill these requirements. Principle number one is let people work from the place they already spend their work time, which is the email inbox, their email interface. So if they're working from Outlook and we can find a way to get information out of that inbox into a centralized location where it can be edited and accessible, that's really a win. You don't want to direct people to a different place. Second principle is make it easy for people to classify emails and documents. You know, we all know the story of metadata. Microsoft has been big on using metadata. It's extremely difficult out of the box to get people to supply lots of metadata. There have been many attempts over the years for many different products to try and get people to classify, and it's difficult because people, when they're in the process of working, they want to focus on their task. They're not really focused on knowledge management, future needs. They just want to get done what they need to do. So metadata is a great mechanism, it's a great tool, but it has to be made easy for people to do the right thing. So as we say, make the right thing the easy thing to do, and then people will do it. Because once you're able to capture and classify the information, if it's all located in a centralized location and classified accurately in a standard fashion that people understand, then it becomes very easy to discover. So that's the third part, is to provide tools where people can discover the information. Microsoft has great search capabilities, but how do you make that accessible, again, to people in the place where they spend their work time in email, rather than asking them to go off and learn a new interface? So before we look at Microsoft's different options for email management, and there are several, we'll look at the pros and cons of what you can do in order to get a handle on this. We're going to ask another poll question, and for that I'll turn it back over to Maya.
Okay, our second question is, in your organization, what percentage of emails do you need to locate later for business purposes? 0 to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75%, or 76 to 100%. Okay, let's see the results.
Okay, interesting to note. We see that about 38% say it's between 0 and 25, which is pretty much what Our study showed, again, being down in the 5% range, but we have a wide swath of numbers here. So about 38%. About a third say it's between 26 and 50%, and 28% say it's 50% or more. So I think it's not exactly the numbers we came out with in the study, but it does show that there's a need across a wide band of different types of users to retain and be able to find quite a bit of the emails, quite a high number of emails. So if we look at these numbers, it's maybe not 100%, but it's certainly a huge number and amount of it. So the conclusion I have from this is, from the audience response, email management is something which is important. This is going to require, because of the high numbers of things that need to be retained, there's going to be a huge need in being able to capture and organize information. So let's dive right in and see what the Microsoft options are for email management. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 different options. Option number 1 is what some of you mentioned at the top we're doing in the first poll questions. That's to maintain emails in Exchange and maintain documents in SharePoint according to the the Microsoft dictates for documents. This is let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of this. So the pros are, there's no need for user training. People just continue doing what they're always doing. You can try and use things like Outlook rules to automatically archive emails or move emails to folders based on some criteria like subject name, subject words. You can also take advantage of some of the newer tools like Office 365 Content Search eDiscovery tool to be able to find information from both Exchange inboxes and email folders, as well as from SharePoint. The downside of this is that content is stored in multiple places. Let's think about this for a second. If you're working on a deal with a customer and you get an email request for a proposal, and you send back an email saying, this is my contract and here are the terms of the contract. The email contains part of the story, the document contains part of the story. Moving the email in one place, putting the document in another place, makes finding related information extremely difficult later on. People are always focused on the business task. They're not focused on looking for specific artifacts. So when somebody in the company later wants to go back and find out what's happening with that deal, very difficult to be able to piece together the different puzzle pieces when they're all stored in different places. Second of all, there's no classification for email. There's no way to really add any sort of meaningful metadata to email in Exchange. So other than a text search, it becomes very difficult to find, or some sort of ad hoc, again, using rules maybe to put them in a place automatically. You're also dealing with mailbox sizes. Depending on the number of emails and the size of your emails, at some point you'll have to deal with a finite mailbox size per user. Probably the biggest problem is that these emails are not visible to colleagues or auditors or other people in the company. So if an employee leaves the company, those emails pretty much go away. Theoretically, they could be archived, but finding them would be pretty much an impossibility. So keeping things locked in individual people's container space is really not a good decision if you need to have other people be able to find information related to customers, partners, suppliers. And then attachments also become a question, because you save the emails and the attachments are also part of that in Exchange, or the emails get the attachments are saved somewhere else. Again, multiple places, not clear where to find the information. So this is a kind of the default strategy, because this is kind of what happens out of the box, but it's probably not the best strategy for a scalable enterprise. Option number 2 is something that came up, has been available for a while. That is one of the disadvantages of keeping emails in individual inboxes is that they're not accessible to other people. Microsoft does provide the capability of what they call group mailboxes. So you can put emails in the group mailbox, then it does become available to other people, at least in theory. Keep documents in Teams is one way, or in SharePoint. I mean, kind of the modern way if you're working with Office 365 is to move the documents into Teams, because you also have conversations. So you can put documents either in SharePoint or Teams and conversations in Teams. And documents in Teams also, as you know, are actually stored in a SharePoint location. It's visible through Teams, but the physical storage is actually in a SharePoint location. So let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of this approach. So the pros, as I said, emails now become visible to colleagues, to other people other than the person whose mailbox it is, because it isn't a group mailbox. It's really easy to set up groups or teams to get started. It doesn't require a lot of instruction. And again, using the Office 365 content search tool, you can find things, again, in theory, across different physical locations. But as with the option number one, content is still stored in multiple places. Although it looks like you're putting information in the group mailbox, it's still an Exchange. You put it in Teams, it's really still in SharePoint. Conversations now in Teams, it becomes even more complex. So you have now 3 places potentially to look for information. And again, there's no classification for emails. Just the fact that it's in a group mailbox does not solve the problem of classification. So even if it's in a folder or in a particular mailbox, it's still not any easier to find. This method also requires users to manually move content. So if we started at the top and said that if you ask people to change user behavior, you're going to run into roadblocks. This is certainly a roadblock that you'll have to deal with. Explaining to people how to move things into the group mailbox, explain to people what the concept of a group mailbox is. And then when you work according to this strategy as well, team documents, although they do get stored in Teams, which are SharePoint locations, they get stored with no metadata. So while they are physically in the place where they should be in terms of document storage for document management, there's no real way to find them later on. And again, we have the same issue with attachments. Where do you put them when you have several different places where each component goes somewhere else? So option number 3 says, let's look at one centralized location that you all have, which is SharePoint. Let's put the emails in SharePoint. Let's put the documents in SharePoint or in Teams. But if we do put them in Teams, let's use metadata. And let's have the conversations in Teams. And here we're starting to coalesce. We're condensing the number of places, physical locations that we're using to store information, which is one of the problems of being able to find information. By having fewer places to go to find it, we've solved one of the ways to do that. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of this approach. So the pros is, as I said, single repository for all information. So you can get everything into one place. You have a single interface for all the information, so you can extract and do search for it in one place. It also makes use of the built-in permission model. So if you put something in a particular place in SharePoint or in Teams, whether if you put an email, the virtue of the place of where those permissions in that SharePoint location, those will be inherited so that only people who are able to view that location will be able to view the emails. You don't have to build another access level, permissions level on top of what you already have out of the box with Microsoft. Now, the way to do this and to make it easy for people to find is that you do use metadata. So in this case, SharePoint metadata can be extended, and this is something that Harmony has been quite vocal about and making easy for people to do, is to extend SharePoint metadata also for emails. Emails are documents, as we said before, because the emails are also things that need to be saved. That the fact that they're not a doc file or an Excel file doesn't mean that they're not records that need to be maintained for business. So using a uniform metadata methodology for all types of documents and records is a way to make it easy for people to find related information later on. And the e-discovery now captures everything in one place. You don't need to have a tool that goes out to multiple places and tries to connect the dots. You basically can just search in one place and find all the relevant and related information. The one con here is that there is an additional step needed. It doesn't happen automatically in most cases. You will need to have people upload email messages to SharePoint. And as we said before, that anytime you have people ask people to do something differently, you run the risk of dropping off and having people not do what you're asking them to do. So, moving on, what is the final recommendation? What is the recommendation that we make for having emails and being able to find them later on? One of them is to be able to find emails and documents later. You want to have a single repository. You want to have uniform metadata. The one thing you don't want is you don't want to have emails and exchange documents in SharePoint and conversations in Teams. You don't want to spread your information out across multiple locations. You want to have everything in one place, and you want to have all the uniform metadata so you can do easy searches and make information easy to find later on. And secondly, the second principle that we talked about is in order for the email management initiative to be successful, it's not enough to provide the tools. The user experience has to be in focus, which means making the right thing, the easy thing for people to do, doing all this work while staying in their inbox, but doing things behind the scenes that make sure that all the information gets taken care of as described. So the one last thing to show is to switch over and actually show how this works in practice. I'm going to show a short demo of how Harmony works and how Harmony makes it super easy to be able to capture emails and documents in SharePoint and in Teams, and also to be able to find that information later on. So the key is to stay within the user's inbox. And what you see here in front of us is we're looking at somebody's Outlook inbox. And on the right side of the screen is the Harmony window. So I'm looking at the favorites view right now, and you can see that some of my favorites include different teams and team channels that I'm connected to. So you can see I'm connected to a team called Accounts and one called RW Sales Team, and within Accounts I've got a number of different channels that I'm a part of. I also have other favorites that come from SharePoint sites, so I can the Harmony window pretty much gives you a full view of your different sites that you're connected to, so you can look at different sites, you can drill down, you can locate documents, and as I'll show you shortly, you can also do search from here. And you can also look at your teams and groups that you belong to, all according to the what you've signed up for in terms of Office, in this case, Office 365. This also works for on-premises. In that case, of course, you won't have the access to Teams, which don't work on premises, but you do have the full accessibility to all the document management resources directly from the email window. So you can, let's go back to the favorites view. So for example, if I want to drill down on the legal folder, I can see I have all these different documents, and then these documents are, of course, documents I can open and work from here. I can share with other people. But before we actually talk about sharing, let me show you how we make email capture super easy directly from the email window. So today it's becoming more and more popular. I'll show both cases of saving information to SharePoint directly, but as people move to Office 365, it's becoming more popular to want to bring the Teams conversation together with the documents and emails all into a single place so that the conversation all resides within a Teams discussion. And I'm going to show you how you do that right here. So for example, I get an email that comes from outside the company. It's not a type of conversation that can happen in Teams. And for most cases, for most organizations, it's not practical to have outside people working together with the company in teams. Not for technical reasons. You can add partners, you can add external people to a Teams channel. However, when the relationship finishes, terminates, all the information resides only in one of the parties' repositories, and that's not really something that's acceptable from a business practice. So a lot of information for that and other reasons will continue to, with outside partners, will continue to happen in Teams for the foreseeable future. So I can just take this email with an attachment. Let me see, open the email, you see it's got an invoice. I can take this email and drag it directly to a Teams channel, just drag and drop it. And what you'll see in a moment is the email is being uploaded to the Teams channel, which means the SharePoint location associated with the Teams. And you'll notice that I am prompted for metadata. So in this case, it's not required metadata, but there's metadata. We'll see a case in a moment where there's required metadata as well. And I can say that this inquiry is related to a merger, and I can just give a title. We'll call it test. And when I do that, the information gets, both the email and the document get uploaded to the Teams channel SharePoint location. And I can start up a conversation with that. So I'm prompted to, as this information will appear, and I'll show you in a moment, in the conversation in that Teams channel, I'm prompted to add a message. So I can say, you can use, of course, to mention somebody. I say I want to share this email, good stuff to read. When I do a post, I'll show you how this looks like in Teams. This information not only gets stored in the locations, but I can continue in Teams. So I click on Teams. I'm going to open it, my Teams folder, and you'll see right here at the bottom of the screen, hi Gloria, I'd like to share this email and attachment, good stuff. And you'll see that the email and the invoice have both been appended to this, and so these become part of the conversation. Now, not only has it become part of the conversation, as you'll see in files, the information becomes uploaded here. So you have that information, the email, you see the document here. The email also can be stored there, or it can be stored in a group mailbox. We support both. But the important point is that information also inherits or gets the metadata that we provided. So this is the only practical way to get emails and documents into Teams with metadata so that it can be found later on. There may be other ways to attach an email to a conversation. Without the metadata, though, it becomes very difficult. As you start to have more and more channels, you start to have more and more people communicating, trying to figure out where that document is within the conversation or within the overall team structure becomes a nightmare. So this is super important to being able to make this streamline. I can, of course, do the same operation. Let's find another email. I can do share another email here in a SharePoint site. So this is not a Teams SharePoint site. It goes directly into the SharePoint. In this case, this folder has different metadata requirements. You see the red dot indicates these are required metadata fields. So I can specify other metadata here. Things that are marked in red are required. So I can do glory. And once I do save, that information I also prompts me to do a check-in, making sure that it becomes available to other people so that I can find that information. Now, if I go drill down into that folder, and you can see information was just added right here. I can find the information. I can, of course, see all the information about properties. So I can view the properties directly from here, all the things that I had just added in. I can also find version history is maintained automatically. Importantly, you can also apply a retention label. So for example, we talked before about retention schedules and being able to provide, retain things only for the period of time that you need so you don't end up having too much junk. You can apply the Microsoft retention labels directly from here everything stays within email. No need to go to another place. No need to learn another interface. Everything is really quite smooth and simple directly from here. Let's go back to our favorites again. And if I look at the channel that we put the information into this Glory channel, I can right click and I can open the file in, I can either open it in the Teams tab or I can open it in the Teams app. So I can find this information, open it in the most convenient way that's possible. So I'm going to open it in the Teams app. And when I do that, this is also within the email window, I can see all the documents and emails that are located and associated with this particular channel. So I can either look at the ones in the Glory channel or all the channels associated with the accounts team. And then I can look for things like, a tax opinion letter. And once I find that letter, I can either open the file location. So I could do this first. It'll take me back to my SharePoint view, my SharePoint and Teams view. I can find that letter directly here in the window, or I can also open it directly online using the native app. So it just opens that directly for me. I can start editing it. I can close it. It'll be checked back in. But again, everything is done directly from the email window, and there's no need to navigate to different apps. No need to go to another view, and you have to open different browser windows. You can do bulk operations. So for example, I can upload multiple emails to one. If I want to add multiple emails to one location, I can drag multiple emails in and do that. And again, associate, if prompted, I can also associate metadata from multiple emails and documents in one go without having to do that individually. So we've looked at capture and classify. We made it super easy to get information directly into SharePoint, into Teams, without leaving the Outlook window. We've shown how we associated metadata. Now the third part is, let's go and see how we can actually find information. So we've incorporated the Microsoft search capabilities directly in the window here. So if I look for things like, do searches in here, I can find, I'm looking for merger and Glory, so I can find things like the merger structure document, and I can find that stuff right here. Using the metadata, it's very easy to be able to locate things directly in this window. So being able to capture, classify, search, being able to find things easily, this is all part of what makes this so successful for email management. Again, we want to be able to capture what we need. We want to keep it for the amount of time we need it, but we also need to be able to find it later on, and that's really what Harmony is all about. And with that, I will turn it back over to Maya. One other thing I wanted to maybe mention before we turn it back over. One of the customers, Hilton, is using Harmony for email and records management. Huge company. In their case, they were looking to reduce the amount of email that they kept. So over retention was the big problem there. They were able to delete almost all the emails, almost 99%, 0.9% of the emails that they were deleted because they only wanted to keep a small amount, which were records. Even that small amount was an enormous number of emails considering the size of the organization. And they were able to do that without having to train people because they're working and stay inside the email window. With that, I'll turn it back over to Maya for questions. And
okay. Before we move to the question you submitted, we have one more question for you. Would you like to be contacted by a Harmony representative? Yes, I'm an existing customer. Yes, I'd like to trial Harmony. Yes, I have some questions, or no thanks. Okay. Here's the first question for you, David. Do you see people using group mailboxes, or do most people put important emails in SharePoint?
But once again?
Do you see people using group mailboxes, or do most people put important emails in SharePoint?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've seen a number of companies, large companies, who've tried to use group mailboxes as a way of storing emails and kind of towing the line, particularly because of retention, to be able to use retention in the Microsoft Compliance Center. Overall, I think the vast majority, almost all customers, we see have interest in keeping things in SharePoint. The complexity associated with the group mailbox really isn't in our experience hasn't really been seen by customers who want to add on that additional complexity to try and merge group mailboxes with documents in two different repositories. So I'd say yeah, it's used, but I would say probably not by too many folks.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Can Harmony be used to upload documents from the computer, or only for uploading emails from Outlook?
No, of course you can upload documents or email documents directly from Explorer. You can just open Windows Explorer and drag it right into a window as well. One of the things I didn't show, perhaps, let me go back to my demo, is not only can you drag, just close this window. Not only can you drag in one direction, but if I write a new email, I can also, of course, Harmony resides in every email window. So even if I'm sending an email, I can also drag a document into from Harmony directly into the email. In this case, I'm sending a link. So using Microsoft's share capabilities, I can share documents with people. Of course, this could also be a OneDrive document, as you saw in the menu. Also, there's OneDrive window. So I can send links, and there's also a capability of holding down the Alt key. I can drag and also send a document. In the cases where I need to send to an external party, also I can send the attachment. Now, when that attachment comes back, we do have a unique way, and I saw this was maybe one of the questions that came in, was a way to maintain the connection between the previous email that went out by maintaining the thread. So even if the person changes the name of the document, changes the name of the email, there is a way to maintain the flow of the thread of the email or the version history of the document. So that's very important to know, and that can also be done as part of a standard implementation.
Thanks, David. We have time for one more question. I thought that retention labels were a Microsoft solution for keeping important emails. You showed us the use of retention labels, but how do they fit into the options you presented?
Yeah, that's another good question. So, and I also see there's another question that came in related to that. So maybe I'll just show this again. So when I right-click on a document, you'll see that one of the options I have is to apply a retention label. What we're doing here is using Microsoft's retention label capabilities. So what we're actually doing here is applying the retention label to the artifact in the repository where it's stored. So in this case, if I'm storing it's a document, I apply a retention label. That retention label is applied to the document in SharePoint. With Harmony, you have two options. When you drag an email into SharePoint or to Teams, you have two options. One option is for Harmony to store the email in a group mailbox, or you can have it stored in SharePoint. If you apply a retention label, the retention label is applied in the location where the email is stored. So if you select the option to have email stored in the group mailbox, the retention label is applied in the group mailbox. In exchange, If you decide to have the email stored in SharePoint, then the email protection label is applied in SharePoint. Regardless of where you decide to store the emails, in the view that I showed you in the Teams window, you will see the email appear together with the related documents. So if you have attachments and an email, the emails and the documents will have a single view that will remain attached, even though they physically may be stored in different locations. So we have that option open to you as well. The idea is to make it easy to find things, regardless of where it's stored.
David, thank you for a great presentation. Thank all of you for joining us today. You will receive an email with a link to view this webinar again within a couple of days, and we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar.